Hi, welcome to everyone. It's great to see so many people here. We've got a great lineup for you. We're going to ask some really important questions. The main one being, what role can communities play in developing resilient, affordable housing that creates great places where people can thrive? We're going to focus on what matters, what do we need to know, and also talk about what's going on out there that Westminster politics has ignored. To look into these questions, we've got a really excellent panel of speakers, and they'll discuss how communities can play a part in developing resilient, affordable housing. We're going to look at the essential elements of policy, people and place, and consider some very practical approaches to enabling communities to shape their areas for the better. There's a really worrying and terrible tendency for Whitehall to create one-size-fits-all policies. And if you've ever bought a piece of clothing that says one size fits all, you'll know that one size never fits all, it only fits some. So we'll be exploring what's actually needed to develop an equitable approach that addresses the extremes of housing in all situations, from affluent to left behind places. We're also going to consider what good looks like in different areas. We're going to talk about how church-owned land can be made available to address the affordable housing issue. We'll be looking at community-led housing as a way to ensure direct community involvement in the development of homes, and also how that can contribute to community wealth building and local growth, enabling communities to keep homes available and affordable in perpetuity. We're also going to look at a hyperlocal example of a grassroots development that demonstrates how a community-driven approach to housing can work in reality. So there's so much benefit to be gained when communities input into place shaping, and it's the communities who are the most knowledgeable in any given area. They know how it ticks, they know what they want from it, and most importantly, they know what's good and isn't good about their area. Many people appreciate the opportunity to change their area for the better, but aren't always able to become involved. So today we'll be discussing how that can happen. So I'm going to just introduce each of our speakers, then they'll speak for a few minutes. Then we'll open up the conversation, starting with some pre-submitted questions. And then if we have time, we'll take questions from the audience. So if you have questions for any of the speakers, then if you pop them in the chat, we can take a look and hopefully get to those later. So I'm going to introduce all of our speakers and then ask them to give their presentations individually. First up, we have Toby Lloyd, the chair of the No Place Left Behind Commission into Prosperity and Community Placemaking. Toby was the head of policy for shelter before moving to government as the PM Special Advisor for Housing and Local Government. He's now the chair of the No Place Left Behind Commission, which was set up by the Create Streets Foundation to explore the potential for community empowerment and placemaking in left behind places. Then we have the Right Reverend Dr. Graham Tomlin, apologies, Bishop of Kensington and Vice Chair of the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission on Housing, Church and Community. Graham was the first Dean of St Mellitus College, and soon after becoming Bishop of Kensington, he was involved in the response to the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. He's the author of many books, most recently the intriguingly titled Why Being Yourself is a Bad Idea and Other Countercultural Notions. We have Tom Chance, the Chief Executive of the National Community Land Trust Network, and Tom previously worked for the Greater London Authority in housing and planning policy, and also as the head of office for the Green Party group on the London Assembly. He joined the National Community Land Trust Network in May 2016, and he now leads on the network strategy, policy and advocacy. And finally, we have Sue Hunter, chair of the Land Development Group, Distington Big Local. Sue's worked in the NHS, in the pharmaceutical industry, in retail, and as a marriage registrar. After retiring, Sue ran a small holding with her husband, breeding sheep, chickens, and pigs. Sounds ideal. When they downsized to a property in Distington in 2014, Sue joined the Big Local Group and became a board member 2 years later. She's now the chair of the Big Local Land Development Group. So some fantastic speakers there who are going to present for around 5 minutes. And then we'll start with Toby. So over to you, Toby.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. Given that we've got some amazing speakers coming up who really do know the ins and outs of the detail of delivering community-led housing on the ground, what its barriers are, what its challenges are, but also obviously the huge benefits it can bring, I thought it might be a bit useful for me to give a bit of a kind of big-scale political overview of the case for community-led housing, and because I can tell you that having tried to do community-led housing projects myself from a very local perspective, having advised local councils, housing associations, the Mayor of London, and worked all at the top of government trying to get this stuff to happen, I can tell you that the case is very, very difficult to make. The system instinctively does not like community-led housing. It doesn't tick anywhere near enough of their boxes in the right sort of way. This means it is a genuinely difficult proposition for government, for local authorities, for housing associations, for pretty much anyone that you would need to get on board to really understand the benefits of community-led housing, let alone to then actually enable it to make sure it happens. It's very, very easy for community-led projects to fall foul of one test or another, whether it's the business case requirement to meet Treasury Green Book appraisals before you can get access to any funding, or local authority thresholds for ensuring that your group is absolutely representative of the entire diversity of your of the local authority. There's any number of different barriers to really getting this stuff through. So I think the first thing to think about, therefore, is what is the problem that community-led housing is trying to solve? And one of the problems here is that all our national systems for dealing with the housing crisis, and pretty much everyone does recognise there's a crisis here, are kind of nationwide, and they're always trying to solve kind of every problem at once. And the truth is that the housing problem is different everywhere. There really are very, very different challenges, and it's hardly surprising that no one solution is going to work in every location, because none of the approaches we have at the moment are working in every location. Without getting into kind of the vast panoply of different scenarios that we face in different communities around the country, very crudely, I'm going to kind of stereotype the problem as being two types of issue. One is that in some parts of the country, house prices are just way out of line. No one can afford them unless they're already very wealthy, or more likely because they've already managed to buy a house back when they were cheaper. That means that affordability is a real crisis. More and more people are forced to rent housing for far longer than they would want to. They're not able to buy a home of their own. It means there's huge pressure on space, so that more and more people are forced to overcrowd. It means that what social housing there is under huge pressure to be sold, worth so much, but also that there's a massive waiting list for people desperate to get in it. We all know, what an affordability crisis looks like. At the other end of the spectrum, and again, accepting this is a bit too crude, there are parts of the country where actually housing is still relatively cheap, but often it's the fact that there isn't enough economic wealth in the area to keep investment in housing up. The housing stock often declines. You end up with a often quite exploitative private rented sector, as speculative landlords have taken the advantage of low house prices to buy up large portfolios for letting out to people who really have no other choice but to let often very poor quality homes on housing benefit rates. So these are two very, very different ends of the problem. In fact, they're almost opposite of each other, because when you come to looking at the main system for addressing these problems, which is essentially government subsidy, the model really doesn't work in either case, because in those high value areas, it means that it's very difficult to make the argument to Treasury that what you need is much more subsidy, because they can see that the more subsidy they pour into expensive places, firstly, why the hell is the Treasury why is the Treasury using taxpayers' money to fund kind of rich people's homes when these homes aren't going to be that affordable at the end of the day anyway? And in fact, there's clearly tons of value there. And what's worse is we can see that when we pour money down the pipes of the subsidy system in expensive places, half the time it just ends up inflating land values, enriching landowners and developers, and not even leading to the kind of public benefits that the subsidy is supposed to be there for. So this quite reasonably makes it very difficult to make the case for public investment. And it's very difficult to persuade people that the housing should be built in these locations, because it's not going to be affordable for them. The existing model based around the system tends to produce fairly unpleasant places, often quite poor quality homes that are extremely expensive in very unsustainable neighbourhoods that don't really offer very much in the way of infrastructure or wider community benefits for people who already live there. So it's hard to make the case to local people to accept housing, and it's hard to make the case to government to pay for it. But then in the other end of the spectrum, equally, the model doesn't work very well, because it's hard to argue with the Treasury that they should really be spending vast amounts of taxpayers' money to build homes in places where homes are already very cheap and plentiful, quite a lot of them are empty. And in fact, often the cost of building new homes is higher than the value of the homes at the end of the day. So there's absolutely no economic case in the Treasury's eyes for public subsidy at all in those places. And equally in those places, often it's very difficult to make the case for just handing sites and planning permission over to developers to build, again, often rather poor quality homes, because it's very difficult for developers to make low value places stack up economically. So our dominant model is kind of failing at both ends of the spectrum. And my suggestion as a kind of opening thought here is that the answer to both of these problems is in fact better involvement of the local community. That's not because it's one answer for all places. It's not one size fits all, but it's precisely because to avoid that problem, you need to have local people absolutely engaged in the planning, the delivery, the shaping, the long-term management, the ownership of homes and places, because that's the way that we can make solutions that really are appropriate for local places, that work for local people, and that are ultimately much more sustainable. So just to kind of run through that very quickly, that means crudely, in the kind of high value places where the problem is speculation and overpriced housing and lack of community benefit, it means giving local people much greater control so that they can actually determine what needs to happen in that area. It means you need economic interventions that capture more of that land value that's already there and channel it into those community benefits, so it's not just creamed off through high land prices. It means involving people to make the design much, much better, so that local people are more likely to welcome existing residents. And that again means basically a much stronger role for the community in shaping the pattern of development and being responsible for ensuring that those homes retain their affordability in the long run. But equally in less high value parts of the country, where problems can be completely different, what you need again is local community groups to be actively involved in identifying what needs to happen, identifying the needs of the local community, and ultimately being really closely involved in delivering it, so that so that what interventions there are can be seen to be really benefiting local people responding to needs. So as we go into the rest of the conversation, I think it's really worth thinking about how better involvement of the community can meet a multiplicity of different needs precisely by being live to the local varieties that exist right around the country, and resisting that urge of our very centralized national system to impose one-size-fits-all solutions. Thank you.
Toby, some really important points there. If anyone's got a direct question for Toby or wants to touch on something Toby mentioned, then please put your question in the chat. So moving on to Graham.
Thanks, Helen, very much indeed. Really interested to hear Toby's thoughts, and really good to be part of this event today. I come at this not as particularly as a housing expert. I got into housing basically because Grenfell Tower happened in one of the parishes that I'm responsible for. And I was then asked to be the vice chair of the Archbishop's Commission on Housing, Church and Community. And really the idea behind the Archbishop's Commission right from the very beginning was that we don't just need to build more housing units. We need to build more functioning and healthy communities. And the housing has a big role to play in the construction of communities. And I just wanted to begin with, if you like, a broader cultural, philosophical point, I guess, which is that there are a number of trends in our society that maybe militate against community. One is, if you like, that kind of libertarian individualism, that sort of, if you like, the idea of the autonomous individual, freed from the demands of others, freedom to do what I want as long as it doesn't offend anybody else, which tends to encourage us to see our neighbours as a threat, not a gift. On the other side, we've got a kind of tribalism love for those who are like us, love for our family, our friends, our tribe, our nation, which will always leave out the immigrant, the ex-offender, the person who doesn't quite fit in. And that what we actually need in place of both of those is a rediscovery of this revolutionary idea that the primary object of our love is actually our neighbour. That at the heart of Christian faith, of course, is that call to love God and to love your neighbour. this really revolutionary idea that my primary task is to not love not just my friends and my family or my tribe, but the person who happens to live next door to me, which is a truly revolutionary idea. Now, with that in mind, what does that look like in housing, and what's our responsibility towards our neighbour? What does it mean to love your neighbour in the world of housing? And what kind of housing builds strong neighbourhoods? Now, in the commission, what we did right from the very beginning was to stand back and say, well, actually, one of the things that we lack in the housing world and debate, and particularly, we found that in talking to the government and others, is a big picture of what good housing looks like. And so we, looking into our own Christian story, but then came up with 5 key values as to what good housing was all about. And those 5 key values, they all begin with the same letter. You can tell I'm a preacher at the end of the day. They are that good housing is sustainable. It fits with the local environment. It doesn't drain the resources of the world in which we live. It's safe from intrusion or from damage, from fire, from flood. It's stable, enables people to put down roots in the community so they feel they can stay, and places can be made where people can feel stable in their community life. It's sociable. It enables community to take place. It's housing that enables people to come in and out and invite their neighbours in. You need community space to enable that to happen. And it's satisfying. It's a place where you actually enjoy coming home to. You enjoy living there. It has a sense of kind of aesthetic beauty about it as well. So sustainable, safe, stable, sociable, and satisfying. Now, we added one more factor to that, one more S, if you like, which is not a descriptor of housing, but it's a factor without which the housing crisis will not be solved, and that is the element of sacrifice. And that's obviously, of course, a really important theme within Christian faith. But the feeling of the Commission was that much of the cost of the housing crisis at the moment is borne by a particular group of people living in unaffordable, overcrowded, unsafe accommodation. And what we need is an approach to housing where that sense of sacrifice and cost is borne across the board by government, by housing associations, by developers, by landowners, including ourselves, the church. We bear that sacrifice across the board. We focused in the Commission on the crisis of affordability, that we feel that the crisis will not be solved just by building more houses. In the last 20 years, we've had 3 million new houses being built. What that's resulted in is 2.5 million new private rented properties. And that doesn't tend always to lead to the kind of stability that we need, as Toby's been pointing out already. We wanted also to say that this Commission is not one where we're going to say, here's the problem, hand it over to government, you sort it out, because we're aware that we as the Church of England, we have a role to play in this as well. We are major landowners ourselves. We own, as the Church Commissioners, for example, own 100,000 acres, almost, of which 6,000 acres is developable. And so we've been in conversation with the Church Commissioners about how that land is used in a creative way to develop affordable housing. But we've also said that to local churches. And one of the things we wanted to say to local churches across the country is you can play a role in housing in your local areas. About 90% of local churches, and remember, the Church of England, one of the things we have is a presence in every single community across this country. Every village, every town, every suburb has a church in it. 93% of those are involved in some kind of delivery of addressing food poverty, food banks, or giving out food parcels or whatever. Only about 10% are involved in some form of housing need, and very often that's to do with immediate homeless provision. And what we wanted to say to churches is that you can be involved in all kinds of different ways, and we give a number of examples in the report about ways in which local churches can get involved in local housing need. We've got examples, for example, of a group of churches in Keswick in the Lake District who got together, identified a piece of land that they own and set up a community land trust, and simply enabled half a dozen or about a dozen houses to be built on that for local affordable housing. We've got an example of a church in North London that decided to campaign that all those applying to be councillors in their local elections should sign up to say that the policy of the council should be 50% of every housing development should be affordable. And they won that campaign, and so now that's officially part of the council's policy. And we've got a number of other examples of churches that enable drop-in centres for people with housing need to come in and find help, linking them to local housing departments and so on. So all kinds of examples of ways in which local churches, as local community groups, can get involved in housing need within their local area as part of their core mission of what they're about. That's all I want to say. Time is up. I shall hand back to Helen.
Thanks very much, Graham. So, yeah, a man with land I spotted there. Okay, so over to Tom.
Thanks, Helen. I've just got a few pictures to share with you, if that's all right, so it shouldn't be death by PowerPoint. So quick introduction to community land trusts. Wanted to start actually picking up where Graham left off. This quote at the start of the Archbishop of Canterbury's report I like, because it talks about the whole nature of the industry changing, and changing to pick up that challenge that Toby spoke about, that communities are at the centre of it. And our ambition as the national body working with community land trusts is that we do that. We don't just help a few nice examples here and there, but we really want to change the way the industry works to put community at its heart. We're a national membership body. We cover England and Wales. On the map on the left, you can see greenhouses where community land trusts own and have completed properties, and orange dots for those that are in development. And we've looked at where community land trusts are, and they fit quite nicely actually onto Toby's simplistic description that community land trusts tend to either be in very deprived parts of the country where the local market is very depressed and they're focused on things like empty properties or absentee landlords, or they are in very, very expensive areas like central London or attractive parts of the countryside where housing is very expensive and people struggle to afford to stay there. What are they doing? Well, they're building smallish developments of sensitively located affordable housing in villages up and down the country. They are bringing forward a 500 home garden village to triple the size of their village, with the community leading that process and taking ownership of all of the public land and some of the housing at the end of it. They own and run a social housing estate in central London and have just been doing infill development, building new homes on top of their existing homes. They brought back a bakery and refurbished a flat for young homeless people within the shadow of Liverpool Football Club's football stadium in Anfield, and have now just taken possession of the rest of the terrace to bring these homes back into use. They're running shops and pubs and other services, and have often been at the heart of communities' responses to the COVID pandemic, in this case, coordinating food deliveries to the whole parish. They are taking a whole village off of oil heating and trying to install a renewably powered district heating scheme to a village in Cambridgeshire. And finally, they're doing things that have nothing to do with housing whatsoever, such as taking farmland into ownership and stewarding it for conservation purposes. So communities all up and down the country, hundreds of them are just getting on and doing this kind of stuff anyway, in spite of the fact that government and industry find this a bit of a weird thing and don't necessarily understand how to support it. The essence of the community land trust model is hinted in the name, these three principles. And they can do anything with these. So you have a community, meaning a community of place. So it could be a part of a city or a town or a rural parish. Anyone who lives or works in that area can join this community land trust, can participate in it. What they then do is they own land. So they buy land or receive it, have it gifted to them, and take it out of the market. And then they hold that land in trust. And they think, what can we do with this land that will be most beneficial to our local community? And very often that includes holding it for permanently affordable homes. And going back to Toby's point about national versus local policy, they think, what would actually make sense in our community? What are the needs that aren't being met in our community, as opposed to what somebody in Whitehall thinks our community needs? And so often community land trusts come up with definitions of affordability that don't match what the government or others think it should mean. So the community holding land in trust, and then very often doing housing as a key activity, because the housing crisis has led so many people to look for alternatives. There are many other community-led housing approaches as well, and we work closely with our sister bodies for housing cooperatives, co-housing communities, self-help housing, community anchors, tenant management organisations, and it can all get very confusing, but there's a link at the end of my talk just if you want to find out more about it. And the map on the left shows you with blue dots all of them, and you'll see they are all over the country. There's much more of this than you might think. There are in fact between 60 and 160,000 homes in community ownership already. A few years ago, we looked at how many new projects are coming through, how many new homes were being built, and we estimated that communities were bringing forward plans for about 5,000. We've updated that figure at the start of this year, and it's around 23,000. So this is actually now quite a significant number of homes that communities are bringing forward. And if you imagine what it might look if this were more mainstream, in many other European countries, in other parts of North America, this is more readily accepted, that what individuals might want to build or provide their own home, and that communities might come together to address housing issues in their area or to join together to home themselves. And in Berlin, for example, 1 in 6 homes is delivered this way. If you want to get started, the website at the bottom left there, communityledhomes.org.uk, is the best possible place. There's lots of information about all the different approaches, how you do it, the stages you'll go through, where you find the money, and so on. And there are links to the what we call enabler hubs, and there's a map of them there. These organisations across England and Wales, which are locally based and can support you to bring forward a project. And they're local, so they know a bit about your area, and they know the sorts of, your council and other organisations you might want to partner with. And then on the right, if you want to know more about community land trusts, you can look at our website or get in touch with us. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Tom. Some really great examples of people doing this already, and some great resources. Just to remind you, I'm sure you've got burning questions to ask, so please put them in the chat, and somebody will forward them to me so I can ask them later. So that shimmies nicely into the specific information that Sue's going to give us about a place that's actually doing this.
That's right, yeah. I think Trin's going to run me some slides. If she could bring the first one up, thank you. So I'll jump straight in because it's going to be hard fitting everything in. So Distington is a medium-sized village in northwest Cumbria. It's about 1,600 people. There's a lot of old and poor social housing in the village, and it fits in with the profile of low property values and very low rents in the area. Next slide, please, Trin. So in 2016, a 1.7 acre piece of land became available in the middle of the village for sale. It was the old British Legion Club and car park. And the Distington Big Local were approached by people in the community to ask whether it could be bought for the village. So we had a public meeting about it, and the majority of people wanted it to happen. So we used some of our Big Local funding to buy the land for £82,000, which gives you some idea of what property prices and land prices are like in the area. So we then needed to decide what to do with it. And there were lots of different suggestions, some of which were pretty hilarious. But we needed to do some serious community consultation, investigation into the land. And because at the time that wasn't designated for housing in the Copeland Council's plan. So we formed a land group subcommittee, which for my sins I am chair of. And we started working with various people, one of whom was Andy Lloyd, who's a consultant for the National Community Land Trust Network. You'll be pleased to know. And he did a housing needs survey for us. And we started working with Bill Halsall, who was recommended to us of Halsall Lloyd Partners, architects and designers, who've worked extensively with community groups in the past. And Bill was also an expert on dementia-friendly design in housing as well. So with the help of Halsall's, we put together an opinion survey, which we hand-delivered the committee to every household in the village to try to approach as many people as possible as to what they thought about the idea of putting housing on the land. Although we didn't get a particularly high return, which I think is pretty common in these circumstances, the majority wanted housing for older people. 2 nursing homes in the village had fairly recently been closed down. So we started looking at the suitability of the land. We consulted highways and they agreed that the access was adequate and that they would be prepared to adopt the road on completion. And Copeland Council Housing Department were very keen on the scheme as well, because they didn't have any of this sort of housing that we were looking at on their books at the time. So we were aiming towards a development for older people, all affordable, whole development affordable, and as high quality as we could produce it, but also with dementia-friendly design built in. So once we had some sort of design put together, we had an event in a tent. We invited the community to come along and look at a design model of what the land might look like. and information boards. The local MP was there and the local press. To get people to come, which I know was one of the questions asked, we provided kiddie rides, for one thing, for free, and we also provided free food, but the free food ticket wasn't given until people looked around the exhibition and gave us a feedback form. So we got a lot of feedback, and over 80% of people were in favour. Next slide, please, Trin. So we next had to decide how we were going to finance getting to planning with this, which was obviously going to be a big job. We didn't want to use all of our big local funding because a lot of it was already earmarked for other projects in the village. So mainly myself and Ingrid, our full-time employee, which big local money enabled us to have, and we couldn't have done it without her. Over the last few years, we've sought grants from all sorts of places, and it is possible to find the money. You just need to know where to look. But particularly Homes England, we spoke to them quite early on, and they were very interested in the project from the point of view of it being a higher quality development with dementia-friendly design. So we thought initially as well that we might apply to be a registered provider ourselves so that we could develop and manage the site into the future. But a lot further down the line, we began to realise that we really didn't have the correct profile to fulfil that. So we decided to go into partnership with an established RP, in other words, a housing association. But we wanted to get the design as far on as possible with the things in that we wanted before we started working with somebody in particular. Next slide, please. So this is a plan of the proposed site. It'll be an apartment block, which is at the bottom of the site, the pink and orange. It's a 35 apartment block of slightly different sized apartments, some of which wheelchair accessible, some of which are 2 beds, some of which are 1 bed, but all of which have flexible design built in so that people living in them can live in them hopefully to end of life. They can be adapted for what they want, for how they want to live. And the other buildings on the site are all bungalows. There are 11 bungalows. The green area is parking, and at the bottom of the site is a sensory garden and landscaping to separate it from the houses around the site as much as possible. Next slide, please. So this is showing you the apartment block. As you can see, it's not just a square block. We've tried to make it look as interesting as possible with a nice airy communal space for people to get together in. Electric buggy store incorporated, and all the dementia-friendly design that we've been talking about. Next slide, please. And this shows you some of the bungalows and the way that they're going to be set out in a kind of courtyard system in front of the apartment block. And most of the bungalows are wheelchair friendly, and all are dementia friendly designed as well. We were trying to aim for a village and community feel of the whole site, not just to turn it into an old folks ghetto, so that other people would come in and out of it as well. Next slide, please. So where we are now. We first submitted our planning permission in spring last year, which raised several things with the council about the height of the development and the size of the development. And once we decided to bring a separate RP on board, we had to do a redesign. So our redesign just went in for planning on the 19th of March, just gone. I've put the reference number of the planning application on there so people can actually go and look at it, because there are reams and reams of plans and information and surveys and all the rest of it. One thing I would like to say though is it would have been helpful for us to have a framework of practical advice for communities in this sort of situation, a central framework. There are loads and loads of different organisations that do things, but it's quite hard to find specifically what you need initially. So that would be one thing that we've learned. But I would just also say to community groups, be brave. It's really hard work, don't get me wrong. It's been a real slog, and we've had to fill in grant applications that a housing association would fill in, who have a department for doing that sort of thing. And we've had 2 of us doing it. But if you can get there, it's a wonderful legacy for your village or community or whatever. And I would encourage everybody to have a go. Thank you. I think I've probably overrun now anyway.
No, thanks, Sue. Spot on. That's excellent. It's really interesting to see the detail and how far you've progressed. Thanks very much to all our speakers. It's a real range of ideas and concepts and approaches, and some really good examples of people who are doing this now. So we've got a few questions now that have been pre-submitted. So I'm going to invite those people to ask their questions. So you can unmute yourself when I say your name. And we're going to take those for each person. So if you ask the question, I'll ask the person to answer it. So Neil McKenna from the Uni of Leeds, would you like to ask your question?
Yep, hopefully you can hear me now. Yeah, so I guess my question, I think all the speakers are really touching on it, but it's getting at this question of what will cause a greater shift in our imagination with regards to housing system and the types of housing that we demand beyond, I guess, people in these sorts of conversations. So it's kind of like communicating what's tangibly different about community-led housing, so visual, oral, experiential kind of differences. So the question really is, how do we capture and communicate the kind of transformative potential of it in comparison to standard housing developments? So what do we need to do to expand activism beyond those politically committed to it to kind of build an alternative future for housing, really?
Okay, thanks very much. So how do we engage? What's different, and how do we engage those that are politically committed already? Broadly, yeah? Okay, to Toby first then, please.
I mean, on both points, I think seeing is believing. You know, people need to experience the joys of community-led housing projects, and then they get it, right? It's you know, policy wonks like me can write as many reports as we like, but you know, it's when people actually experience what a really well-designed community-led housing scheme is really like, and they can suddenly imagine, wow, I can imagine living here. You know, I can imagine that actually that bit of grass outside my house wouldn't just be a kind of desolate waste ground for dogs to crap in, but would actually be a really nice place for kids to play in, right? You suddenly began to imagine the possibilities in your own environment when you see it happening in reality. So I think the first thing is to get on and build stuff itself. I know this is a chicken and egg problem, but the more schemes we can get off the ground and then use them to actually take people around. So, you know, and I think there's been some fantastic efforts done by community housing groups to actually get people to come and visit their places, just literally just to walk around, just have a look. Makes all the difference in the world. And then in terms of how do you engage non-political people, I mean, communities tend to get mobilized by reactions to things, and this is another thing that kind of convinces those in the system that they're just useless. They only ever, you know, we set up this fund to support community groups to get involved with local planning, and none of them bothered, right? You hear this sort of complaint in government all the time. But well, of course not, because people, that's not how communities work. They tend to respond to threats or to opportunities when they land on them. And so whenever these government has attempted to provide funding, it's always been misapplied, because they don't tend to recognize this kind of opportunistic nature of community activism. So actually what we need is systems that recognize that and say, look, here's a pot of money. When you spot an opportunity, when something comes up, when a piece of land comes up for sale, it's there for you to move quickly on, right? But we also need to recognize that, and therefore but like we have with things like the assets of community value register, which give communities just a bit of time to get their act together, because otherwise the market is completely stitched up by those who have you know, professional expertise and £1 million in a bank just waiting to move as soon as an opportunity arises. So we need to stop stuff just being sold on the open market like that, because that will always mitigate against community groups getting in there first.
I think that segues nicely into what Graham's been talking about. So Graham, do you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points, really. I mean, one is, I guess one of the things I learned in Grenfell was that when a disaster happens like that, what steps into the gap at a moment of real crisis is not national government or even individuals, but it's local community groups. It was those local community groups that kind of rallied around. It was the faith groups, it was the faith communities that suddenly became the place where people kind of turned to. And it strikes me that in terms of getting people involved, it's engaging some of those existing local community groups in housing questions. So, for example, for us in the Church of England, it's actually talking to our local churches, those local communities all the way around the country, and saying, look, housing is a real issue, because underlying so many of the social issues that we have are housing. It's either because people can't afford the rent or the mortgage that they're trying to pay, it's they're living in overcrowded housing, or that the state of the housing is actually putting so much pressure upon families that the family breakdown begins to happen, and so on. And it's engaging existing community groups to engage with the housing crisis is a way to do this, rather than just on the individual basis. I think the other thing is I'd say is that one of the things we've done is to produce a set of resources that local churches can look at to kind of evaluate housing in their area. So one of the exercises, for example, is to take that list of 5 things, sustainable, safe, stable, sociable, and satisfying, and to look at your local area and say, well, actually, does housing in our neighbourhood meet those 5 tests? Is it sustainable? Is it safe? Is it stable? Is it sociable? Is it satisfying? And it might be, you might say, okay, yeah, we probably tick 3 of those boxes, but actually 2 of them we really don't. And then it begins to help you to realize what's missing and what's lacking in a local area. And once you realize that, you begin to want to do something about it. So actually, so I think one of the things is having a clear picture of what we're aiming at, working out, how well we're doing on that. And then that begins to give you a clearer picture of what you need to address locally.
And I think both of you have mentioned the notion of responding against, which I think is really interesting in the context of the new planning proposals, where that opportunity is really almost being taken away. But that's tangential. Tom, would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah, I think that the phrase politically committed is interesting, because there are definitely a tiny number of people, I would think, who kind of interested in this stuff as a political issue, but really the vast majority of people who actually start community land trusts, I wouldn't describe as politically committed. They're just doers. And they are people from the groups that Graham talked about, from churches, school governors, somebody involved in a local transition town group, a group of single mums, other ways in which people organise themselves. And the example Graham mentioned of the community land trust in Keswick was really interesting, because that started because the churches came together and had those conversations Graham's describing about. They talked about what's it like growing up in Keswick in the Lake District, if you're a young person or an old person. And every issue they had a discussion about, housing kept popping up as an issue. So they thought, well, we obviously need to do something about housing. One approach that has worked very well to try to stimulate new groups then is community organising, and going out to where people are already meeting and getting them, talking to them about it, and saying, that there are examples just down the road from you of projects doing this that you can go and see. And we used to have a program as well called Seeing is Believing, which would pay for your travel expenses and organise days, and you could go and visit a scheme and have a look at it. So I think that combination of getting people where they're already organised and then taking them to other things and getting them inspired by their examples is absolutely right. I think one interesting dilemma is where the sort of level of social infrastructure and social organisation really quite varies around the country. And so there's a dilemma of what do you do in places where there isn't such strong organisation of people and they are a bit more atomised, which could be actually just places like large new build housing estates where there's been no investment in that and there's nowhere for people to congregate, as well as other ways in which people might suffer. So I think there's something around what we can do more generally to build stronger communities and then engage them with the housing question.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you've all mentioned mobilising existing groups as a way forward in various ways, encouraging them to start to participate and see what other people have done. Sue, your thoughts?
Well, I can only speak for myself, really, but I am not politically motivated at all, and I've ended up being the chair of a land group in the village. It's difficult to say. It's always very, very difficult to engage people. People need to have some reason for engagement. I was trying to think what my reason for engagement, and I think basically when the land came up and I'd just become a director of Big Local, I was the only one that really wasn't involved in anything that had already started going on before I joined. So I was kind of asked, well, do you want to run with this? And I said, well, okay then. And that was kind of how I got involved. we've tried all sorts of things to get the community involved. But at the end of the day, the only thing that's got people to come out of the woodwork was when we finally got to planning, and then everybody thought, oh, this is going to be real. Am I going to really like this, or am I going to want to object to it? I'm not sure I can tell you anything from a sort of national level, but if communities are interested enough, they will do things. But they need to be able to know that they're capable of doing things. And that's sometimes the hardest thing.
Mm.
I wouldn't have known that I was capable of doing what I've done over the last 4 years without actually doing it. So I think that's what that in a lot of ways, it's been almost impossible to reach the people that really are the ones we should be reaching, and to engage them. Like I said, sometimes to get people to come to these events, we've almost had to bribe them with free food or a ride for the kids or something, just in order to get some sort of, otherwise they just wouldn't come. So I don't know if that's any help, but that's
really, it's interesting to look at the barriers to participation in these sorts of things. Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I hope that answers your question, Neil, comprehensively. Okay, so we have a question from David Waddell. If you could ask your question, David.
Hello, thank you. And some of this has been touched upon already. It's a question about persuasion. How do we persuade communities who are currently predisposed against new developments to adopt a change of attitude and inclined to see some potential benefits to their backyard? And I appreciate some of this is about having the right kind of development and fulfilling the 5 S's that Graham has talked about. But the persuasion itself, how do we go about that?
Okay, so that's a good question too. If we start with Sue.
Well, I think I've already said some of that in the last question. We found that it was a very small group to start with, and it was hard to get people to come on board and participate in the early stages. So the thing we've kept doing is just doing community events, every so often doing community events and making sure that everybody knows what's happening. And eventually we have started to get particularly some younger people onto our group, because that's been one of our problems. Virtually all of the directors of Big Local initially were retired women, basically. But latterly we've had some younger ones coming, and I think it's only because we've tried to do as much as possible as far as publicity is concerned with what we're doing, how we're doing it, how we can help, how we can engage. And like I said, community events have been the best way we've found of doing it. Having said all that, we had very little opposition until planning permission went in, and then all of a sudden all these objections came in about, I don't want this building behind my house, and I don't want this overlooking the school, and I don't want this, so and that's one of the reasons why we've had to address a lot of these issues and do a redesign. But I'm hoping that we've done enough now to get it through. And I think once the community realise that we've got the planning and it is possible and it is going to revitalise the centre of the village, the people living around it might realise that it will actually improve the value of their house or the environment they're living in. But you've just got to keep trying.
Absolutely. Same question to Tom.
Yeah, I think that often in many cases there'll always be some hardline people who will just object to housing development, but in our experience with Community Land Trust, and I can only really speak about that sector, the idea of local control and local benefits hugely reduce opposition to new development. So the local control side is, if you've done all that community organising I mentioned, and if you've got the school governors and the single mums and the church group and so on involved in the group and thinking about what homes are coming forward and they're in control of the process, they're much more likely to design a scheme that's actually going to meet local needs and is going to deliver a local benefit. And no, they may well then work in partnership with a housing association or with a private developer to do it. They're not just wanting to do it all on themselves necessarily. And that's why a lot of housing associations are now quite keen to work in partnership with communities in this way, because it means that it's delivering a higher quality scheme that's really meeting local needs. And then the local community is much less likely to object to it. And the most common objections you hear are either, we don't want luxury flats, or we don't want executive homes. And sometimes it's a bit of a stereotype and it's not really fair on whoever's trying to develop some homes, but it speaks to an anxiety that what's being built isn't meeting local needs. The community land trust movement, I mean, they've been very successful at getting developments approved through planning and with very little community opposition and unanimous decisions in planning committees in areas of outstanding natural beauty, in national parks, in infill urban areas like building on top of existing homes on a council estate, the sorts of things that would normally cause huge ruckus and get everyone up in arms. And there are sometimes some objectors, but I think it's that point that if you really put communities in the driving seat to determine what they need in their area, then by and large, most people are decent people who do care about their community and want to see the right sort of homes provided.
Thanks, Tom. Graham, your thoughts on resistors?
Yeah, thank you. I think two thoughts on it. I guess one, I suppose during the pandemic of the last year, one of the things we've rediscovered in some ways is the value of the local and the sort of value of real local connection, whether that's, clapping the NHS on your doorstep or just shopping for neighbours who needed someone to go and get some help. And one of the things we really value is a sense of community. And that's because I think we're made to live in community. We're made to live as not just as autonomous individuals, but actually in connection with each other. And so therefore housing developments seem to have it to start with this fundamental conviction that housing is fundamentally about community. It's not just about individual units that enable people to live isolated lives. And if we start from that point, that housing is essentially about community, then you begin to develop an approach to a new housing development, which is primarily about how does this enhance community life, not diminish it. And I think that's what people fear, that if we're going to have a whole new housing development over here or whatever, it's going to somehow diminish my individual life or my community life, but particularly the community aspect. And I think if people feel that actually this development is going to enhance the community in some way, then they're more likely to be in favour of doing it as well. So that's one point, I think, is stressing the kind of in terms of communication, whether that's developers, whether whoever is involved in doing this, is enhancing the kind of community benefit of new housing and being really explicit about that right from the very start, rather than other motives in it. I think the other thing is about quality. Conversations we had in the course of the Housing Commission was actually with the Duchy of Cornwall, who've done a lot of interesting housing developments. And their perspective on this was that actually if you develop really good quality housing, actually people quite like having good quality housing in their local area. If you develop really bad quality housing that is just shoddily put together and is really not particularly attractive, then no one wants that kind of in their neighbourhood. But there's something about build quality, about sustainability. Again, that's a key aspect for many people. It's actually addressing those kind of issues, the sort of sociability, the sustainability point, explicitly in housing developments. That's going to much more get people on board with housing developments as they come up.
Okay, thanks, Graham. So much more on the lines of beauty and quality. So, Toby, what are your thoughts on the dissenters?
I mean, I would agree with everything that's been said, but just to add to that, the other key thing is, of course, infrastructure, right? This is the classic objection that people raise. This is going to overburden local infrastructure. Now, sometimes that's not an entirely good faith objection, but I think we have to recognise it's often a very real concern. And the simple answer is that, well, new development ought to provide the infrastructure that is needed, both in terms of like capturing land value through existing mechanisms to ensure that you don't, just add new people to a village without thinking about the burden on the local GP, for example, and that you are providing the resources there. But also, again, it's back to this thing of just engaging with local people and working out what they want. And I was involved in a community engagement exercise in Medway, where when we were consulting on trying to on a admittedly hypothetical proposal for a new garden city, funnily enough on church commission land grant. But when we consulted local people, the main thing that what they wanted that would really help them feel more positive about a new development, this was a big development on greenfield land, was a new supermarket. That completely surprised me, right? But that's an easy thing for a development to provide. That makes money. I mean, I thought it was going to be kind of a long list of very expensive things that were going to really affect the financial viability. No, what they really wanted was a better supermarket in the area. and no one had picked up on that because no one had bothered to ask them.
It's a really important point. The social infrastructure associated with housing is as important or more important really as the developments, and the danger being lots of little developments that aren't connected to place miss that opportunity sometimes to think about what is the social infrastructure requirement. We've got a final question, and I'm going to ask you to answer these quite quickly, for this one quite quickly. And we've touched on some of this already, but Isabel Barnes has asked, beyond additional funding, what can central government do to support local communities to build more housing or improve housing in their local area? So it's a very specific question about what, other than funding, can central government do to support this movement? So I'm going to go to Tom first.
Thanks, Helen. Right. Funding is absolutely critical. I know we're saying beyond funding, but the Community Housing Fund, which people have mentioned a bit in the chat, which we've worked on for many years and our members succeeded in getting, has been critical to that number of homes going from 5,000 to 23,000 homes. It's meant that Sue could bring her project forward. That funding we're working hard with government to get that reopened for the next year, and it needs to continue and be put on a longer footing. The other thing is, we've been talking to government about their planning reforms. How can communities find it easier to get opportunities with land, whether it could be their own for something doing themselves or other developments? For big developments coming forward, there could be some space in that for the community to take some of the homes on or to take some of it forward. And also more opportunities for partnerships, particularly local councils, if they're looking to develop housing themselves, if they have their own housing development company, or they have relationships with developers and housing associations and others in the area. Helping communities access those opportunities for land and partnerships can be really powerful.
Thanks, Tom. To you, Sue.
Yeah, I mean, like Tom said, the funding really was crucial for us. I'm not sure that we would have known how to even start approaching it if it wasn't for the funding. So if there was no funding available at all, you see that the problem with us is that our development was kind of a backside first one, in that the land became available and we bought it because we had the big local money. So there wasn't a particular push for housing in the area. I think you would need an extremely committed group to approach any sort of housing development if there wasn't extra funding available. I mean, I just don't know how they could do it. So maybe I'm not the person to ask, really.
But you have that experience, so you know how hard it would have been without.
Yeah. It would have been. I would have said it would have been impossible for our group. The constitution of our group, because the big local money not only bought the land, but they paid for our DBL employee, who did a lot of the admin and paperwork for us as well, which would have been, it just wouldn't have been possible for the people that we had on the group.
Thanks, Sue. And quickly over to Toby.
There's loads of things that government can do apart from providing money. The biggest barrier to community-led housing is access to land, right? And government writes the rules here. Government writes the rules for access to land. So we should be massively improving the ability of local authorities to compulsory purchase land, right? Not even because we want them to do so, but just because that changes the balance of incentive on landowners to play nicely, rather than always holding out for the maximum possible theoretical market value. We could be using public land much more smartly, and actually, rather than just insisting that we get top dollar for public land when it's sold, but actually baking into the requirements to release public land that it actually serves community benefit, right? That would give communities a huge opportunity to do so. As I mentioned before, there's things about the way that intervening in the timing of the process, so that the fact that community groups don't always have £1 million lying around on them. Actually, the process has been rejigged so that they can step in and say, hold on, there's an opportunity there. We need some time before this is just sold to her on the open market. So yeah, there's loads government can and should be doing to improve access to land right now.
Thanks, Toby. So I'm conscious that we're 1 minute over, and there are a lot of questions being put in the chat that I think people basically, we love you to stay on and ask the questions to the speakers. We've lost Graham, unfortunately, because he's had to go to another meeting. But for those of you who aren't able to stay, thank you very, very much for joining us, and thank you to all of our fabulous speakers. For those of you who can hang on, we'll do some more informal question and answer and discussion. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.